Thanks, Gary. I think I probably need to apologize to the audience as well, because they all came here expecting to hear totally new ideas. And what we're hearing about is education, effective government, the internet, and mine is also a fairly mundane one, which will be smart cities. But I think the theme behind it is you don't need new ideas. We just need to effectively implement the ones that we know about. For me, it was urbanization that got me thinking, because we all saw the statistic a couple of years ago that more than 50% of people now live in cities. When I dug into that, it's actually 3.5 billion people that are now living in cities, and that's equivalent to the entire world population in 1968. So that's when I was 10 years old, and you thought the world is a huge place and billions of people, and now all that amount of population are living in cities. And between now and 2050, another 3.5 billion will be added to that number in cities. And 90% of that will be in the developing world. So now what's so special about that? I mean, cities today, they occupy about 3% of the land mass, but they take up 60% of energy, and they produce around about 70% of global emissions of pollution. So if you're going to add another 3 billion people to the ones that are already there, we're going to have to do something different. And therein comes the concept of the smart cities, where you're talking about how we produce energy, how we distribute energy, how buildings are made intelligent. But I always wondered why buildings are intelligent but cities are smart. I guess we'll find out.
It's the consultants. They have to come up with new words. So
intelligent buildings, how we move water around, how we move waste around. And all that has to be thought of. And in the next 20 years, because of what's happening in the cities, people reckon that about $40 trillion will be spent on urbanization, on cities, on infrastructure in cities. And how we build that infrastructure will tell a lot about whether we increase the way that we're attacking the planet or whether we try and improve it. And smart cities, of course, will go towards improving it. And then I thought, maybe let's try and talk about some examples. So if you look at Stockholm, you've got the Royal Port area in Stockholm. And they're building a smart grid around that, which will be powered by renewable sources as well as traditional sources. That power will go to homes, factories, and the port, as well as ships in the port. And I'll come back to why ships in the port in a little while. But they hope that in the next 20 years, that whole entire grid in that area will be powered by renewable sources, including solar and wind. Now, why ships in the port? A ship, when it comes to port, tends to run its diesels to generate electricity. And normally ships stay in a port for about 10 hours. During those 10 hours, a ship will produce about 20 tons of CO2. So now you suddenly think of all the thousands of ports, and I live in Singapore, the world's biggest port, and think of the thousands of ships that are coming there, running their diesels, producing CO2 stuff. And the simple idea is just plug them into the grid instead of letting them run their diesels if they need electricity. And if you can plug them into a grid with renewable sources, even better. So that's what Copenhagen did. It's one of the first countries to do that, but there are also now pilots in Shanghai and in Hong Kong to try and do the same thing. And we're trying to persuade the Singapore government to do the same thing in Singapore as well. So smart ways to power ships and ports. If you think about buildings, intelligent buildings, think of the amount of light that's wasted in a building when no one's there. So a lot of buildings now have sensors in there. They automatically turn the lights off when people are not there. A good example is the National Library in Singapore. What they do is they have the light sensors even better tuned, and they adjust the light according to the amount of sunlight that's filtering in. And if you can build a building which uses natural sunlight and then adjust the internal lighting, what they've been able to do with that is the energy consumption of the National Library in Singapore is something like 102 kilowatt hours per year. And you compare that to the Singapore average of 220. So they've halved the energy use just by intelligent use of lighting. Now, if you think of the amount that goes into heating or cooling, you can also have buildings that actually heat or cool themselves, or preheat or pre-cool at times when energy is freely available. So why not cool a building more at night in Singapore when there's cheaper energy available, and allow that through good insulation to cool for much of the day? Then, of course, transport. Everyone talks about electric cars. The average family car will produce 6 tons of CO2 in a year. And if we can have electric cars and try and power again with renewable energy, and I keep harping on about renewable energy because I think, especially in this part of the world, just look at the sun, right? There's enough solar energy that falls on the Earth in one day to power the Earth for 1 year. So in a year, we get 5,000 times the amount of solar energy that the Earth produces in 1 year. Now, if we could efficiently harness that, and coming back to electric vehicles, power our vehicles through that, that's a good thing. But then if you think about 6 billion people living in cities, you don't want them all to drive around, even electric cars, right? So we just done a pilot in Geneva on electric buses. And these electric buses pull into a bus stop where, with our technology, a robotic arm comes on immediately, within 1 second of a bus pulling in, hooks it up to a charger, an ultra-fast charger, that charges that bus in 15 seconds. Right? And that 15 seconds is long enough for bus stops, normally 15 seconds. People get in and get off. And at the end of the route, it goes into another place where it's charged for 3 to 4 minutes. And that's enough to keep that bus going all day on charging. So if we can fill a city with electric buses, you not only do away with a lot of pollution, but you also do away with a lot of those overhead lines that look pretty ugly as well.
That's right.
So, I think 3.5 billion people living in cities, another 3 billion to come. We've got to make those cities smart. Otherwise, we're going to go the wrong way.